Welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. This is part 2. I recognise from your names a lot of you were here on Tuesday. Don't worry if you weren't here on Tuesday. This one makes perfect sense by itself. But Susan's done a pair for us with. Tuesday's one was to replace or not replace. How do you decide whether you need to replace your heating system? Whereas today is, assuming you've come to that decision, you've realised you need to replace your heating solution. How do you think about choosing the right solution for your church? Now, I have to manage your expectations. Susan doesn't know your individual churches. She won't be able to tell you the exact right answer for your exact right church. What she can do is tell you the questions to ask yourself and lay out the options, the menu from which you're choosing, so that you can take those options, ask yourself the right questions and narrow it down to a more sensible, kind of feasible shortlist for your church. I always begin by trailing what's to come. So on May the 18th, we've got a session that's to help you get ready for the Great Big Green Week, which is coming up at the beginning of June. So this is how to use the Great Big Green Week to engage your local politicians in climate action. And then when we get to the first full week in June, it is Churches Count on Nature, when we hope that churches all around the country, church communities will be going out into the churchyard and recording the amazing biodiversity that you find in your churchyards. And during that week, we run our national webinars themed around land and nature. There's a different topic every day, Monday to Friday. You can see them there. Then when we get to later in June, we're back onto the nuts and bolts. We are repeating our webinar on church solar panels, and Susan will be repeating today's session again on June the 27th. So if you get to the end of today's webinar and think, oh, I do wish that my colleagues had been there, don't worry. Firstly, we're recording it, and secondly, they can come along on June the 27th. Now, it's not a webinar, it's training, but I'm also just letting people know about our heat pump training day. That's a whole day online on the 5th of October. I'll put the information about those webinars and the booking links in the chat when I've finished. Housekeeping is the usual. We're using the Q&A for your questions, not the chat. So plop your questions in the Q&A and tick the thumbs up next to other people's questions if they're ones you're interested in. We did find on Tuesday there were far more questions than we had time for. So it is really useful to use that thumbs up if you see a question similar to yours, because then those ones will go to the top. After the webinar, I'll send everybody, oh, Susan, you need to let me have your slides if that's possible, and then I'll send them out to everybody along with the links in the chat. And we are recording the webinar and we will share it through our website and through our YouTube channel. For those of you that were here on Tuesday, you already know about Susan's wealth of wisdom, but for those of you who just come along for part 2, you're in very safe hands today. Susan Logan is a very experienced chartered building services engineer, many years of experience in energy efficiency, in carbon efficient solutions, in working with churches and other types of buildings on their heating solutions. 15 years as the heating advisor for Worcester Diocese. There are not many church heating problems that she hasn't come across in that time. Let me just stop sharing my slides and then Susan can share hers and lead us away.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming along. Just hopefully sharing now. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's worked perfect first time.
Super. Oh, welcome everybody, and what a lot of you there are, and I hope I can deliver some words of wisdom and some assistance. As Catherine says, I probably can't solve your problems, but hopefully can provide a little bit of a route map to working out what to do. So this is all about choosing the best heating system for our church, and if one size fitted all and we could just say this is it, wouldn't life be easy? But life isn't that easy, and so much depends on the type of church you have, the type of use you have, the type of building. So we started obviously on the presentation on Tuesdays and the early ones I did, looking at needs. So I'm not going to go through that in any detail, apart from to say that it is probably the most important thing you will do is to work out what you need. So if you can have a look at a few publications, Church heating publications, the checklist, and earlier seminars, that will help you along the way. Then we're going to look at the principles of choosing a low carbon heating system, because after all, what we are talking about is carbon here. We're looking to bring about a positive change in our churches to mitigate climate change. Then we're going to look at heat sources. What sort of heat sources are out there? What's the palette of them? What can we choose? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of different heat sources? And a heat source is nearly always linked to a heating system. So at the end, we're going to look at the sort of heating system. There's a bit of crossover when we get to electric heating because they are both a source and a system. But hopefully all of that will become apparent as we go through. So I'm going to move this fairly briskly on to allow some time for questions. There'll be bits that perhaps you can read later, so that I won't go into huge amounts of detail. But it's to give you an overview and hopefully give you an idea of what's out there. So the first webinar was to replace or not replace, and just a brief summary here of what that covered. So what we need now, thinking about the future, thinking about reordering and building changes that might affect our heating. Is our heating system adaptable? Does the building need anything special to preserve it? How do we plan and fund and accelerate to lower carbon? And there's quite an important section in that presentation about the new faculty and List A and List B permissions and how they affect heating systems. And I would certainly advise you have a look at those, because that changed quite radically last year. And we no longer have, for example, the ability to replace a boiler like for like anymore, fossil fuel boiler anyway. So I'm not going to say dwell on that too much, but just to sort of note that that's the topics we covered before. So when we go now, we're going to start to think about choosing a heating system, and top of most churches' lists will be what can we afford, and affordability is one of probably the most difficult topics. So my advice is this: plan and plan and plan and plan. Have we got a plan for replacements, upgrades? Are we realistic about the age and condition of our system? Or are we just working on hoping it'll just last a bit longer? Have we got a plan for carbon reduction? That's really important. I do cover that in the previous one as well, but it's really important, particularly when you're seeking permissions, because chancellors will expect you to have a plan for carbon reduction. Can we take action in the short term while we work out a plan? The sinking feeling that any heating advisor will get when you get the call, our boiler has failed, we need to put a new one in, has been, I think, even more increased since the new permissions, because we can't just say, no, you can just put another gas boiler or an oil boiler in. You're going to have to think about it. If you've thought about it already, it makes it so much easier. So don't leave it too late. Don't assume you'll get permission for like. With gas and oil boilers, you probably won't. You will have to think about what you've got to do. There are now quite a scattering of consistory court examples where churches have been challenged about trying to put like for like or carbon heavy systems in. If you've had advice from your heating advisor or from a professional, don't let it gather dust. Make sure you act on it. I have a number of examples of churches where I perhaps visited 10 years ago, and now they've got a crisis. And unfortunately, much as I would like to help, the DAC and chancellor's attitude is, well, you weren't told, and perhaps it's not as easy as you might think. So get those reports out, get those quinquennials out and have a look at them. Have a plan for carbon reduction, which does not have to be a new system. People think that carbon reduction is a new, brown, shiny, expensive system. It isn't necessarily. It can be using a smaller space. It can be putting a hybrid system in to allow you to use a more efficient system for some, if not all, of the year. So it doesn't have to be a new system. And I would say probably a lot of churches I go to, it's not a single answer. So not obviously that was a fairly quick counter through needs, but we move then on to the principles of carbon in heating. Basic principle of carbon in heating. It sounds fairly obvious, but use as little as you can. We'll have a look at slide or two. What does that mean in practice? So once we've minimized the amount of heat that we use, then we should match that as closely as possible. A system is oversized or too hot. That's a very common problem in churches, one has to say, but one that requires an awful lot of input is not efficient. So supply should equal demand as closely as possible. And once you've done that, you use the lowest possible carbon source. Now, why is it in that order? And it is in that order. Carbon heating systems are very expensive and therefore and cost quite a bit. Well, all heating costs a lot to run these days, doesn't it? So you must minimize the size and the demand of your system so that the capital cost is the lowest it can be and the running cost is the lowest it can be. It's not much point putting a massive, great electric heating system that you can't afford to run. So what does this mean in practice? Reducing demand. Insulate when you get chance. If you've got a re-roofing project, talk to your architect about the opportunities for putting insulation in. The same with obviously any building project. Is there an opportunity to insulate? Stop drafts. I've got a little picture there of a Victorian floor grill. The Victorian churches were designed very often for a lot of people and a lot of fumes and odours, and with therefore an awful lot of fresh air. We don't need that amount of fresh air. What we're doing actually is throwing heat out. So look at where the air's coming in and going out of the church. The top picture there is of a duct, a very common floor duct, and these can be quite usefully insulated, as can a very common system, which is suspended timber floors. And it is possible in many instances to get underneath those floors and put some insulation. And not only will that reduce energy, it will greatly enhance comfort. So an awful lot of churches are quite cold underfoot. Use space wisely. Don't heat any more than you need to. Seriously consider for small services of just a few people whether you could heat a smaller space. Deliver heat where it's needed to people. We'll talk a lot about people heating later on. And don't waste heat, putting heat where it's wasted, i.e. heating spaces that you're not currently using. So when we think about supply, we keep the size of system down if we can. We heat where we need it again, we control and we zone it. There's a lot of debate about running continuously or not. And the answer is it depends. If you only use the church once a fortnight, then clearly running it continuously is not going to be a good idea. If, on the other hand, the church is used or spaces are used most days of the week, then controlling the heat between limits to let it cool off a little bit but not right down is probably going to be a better idea. Sometimes we will have to run our heating most of the time to preserve precious artifacts, but not often. Can we afford to heat the space? We've got to be realistic in this day and age with cost of living problems, with dwindling congregations in some places, with increasing fuel costs. We have got to be very, very realistic about whether we can frankly afford or wish to use the carbon to heat a very large space when we don't need it. And that's a hard fact, and it's a hard thing to come to terms with. I know that. But we do have to be practical and realistic on that topic. Now, a little word about hours. So people say to me, electricity is more expensive than gas or oil, isn't it? Well, yes, it is. It's about 3 times more expensive. And then I come back and say, but how long are you running your heating for? So your gas or oil system might cost a third of the pence per unit of the cost of electricity, but how often do we find churches where the heating runs all night to get it just about warm enough for the service? The boiler efficiency may be poor, 75% or less. And we could be heating the whole space, not just people, so maybe twice the heat input. By the time you've looked at all of that, an efficient electric system is 100% efficient. It might be on for 2 hours instead of 8. It might have a lower capacity, and I've put a little example there. 150 kilowatts for 8 hours, delivering 130 kilowatts, 113 kilowatts, 10 pence a unit. That's basically the 113 is after you've taken your boiler efficiency off. That might cost you £100 to £120 for a service. If you can deliver heat to where people are, for example, under pews, with a much lower rated system in kilowatts, yes, your unit cost might be 30 pence, but you're only putting it on for 2 hours, and basically it's a third of the cost. So even with an efficient boiler and 4 hours preheat, it could still be 70. So you might not warm the whole space, but you may deliver comfort, and it doesn't have to cost more. Now, carbon. What do we mean by carbon? Well, here's a little graph here. We measure carbon in kilograms CO2 equivalent. It's a slightly technical term, but it basically it's anything that warms the environment. Refrigerant gases warm it a lot more than carbon dioxide does. So the government put out figures every year. These are average figures. The electricity figures fluctuate day by day. You can look at any point and you will see a different carbon factor for electricity. However, these are averaged over last year. Electricity is still falling and it's coming down. So the amount of carbon, how's that carbon generated? It's at the power station. So if a power station burns gas or whatever else, it emits carbon dioxide. Now, clearly renewables such as wind and solar and hydro emit an awful lot less or nothing. Gas is fairly stable. There's a possibility of greener gas or hydrogen in the future. There's a possibility of it being biogas from decomposition effectively, blended into the mix. Hydrogen could be blended into the mix. Not all hydrogen is green. It depends how it's made. Since I did the last webinar a couple of years ago, electricity is now 24% less carbon impact on average. So this is where our carbon comes from. Photovoltaics, wind and solar are zero in terms of their operational carbon. And biomass has a small impact. Generally, it's a complicated equation with biomass, but there is a sequestration effect of CO2 in timber. But these are government figures. You can debate them, but I use the DEFRA figures as an accepted industry average. So our low carbon heating source, well, our UK electricity is already getting lower carbon. We can purchase true green electricity now via the parish purchasing basket, and biomass is possible in some locations. And we can put, of course, our own generation in terms of photovoltaic panels. So moving on then from principles, what does that mean in terms of available heat sources? And what I'm going to do now is a broad palette really of heat sources. So what to choose? As a principle, the lowest carbon source for the life of the system. Our church heating tends to live an awful lot longer than it does outside in the rest of the commercial world. Partly because it's not used so often, partly that there isn't a lot of times the funding to replace it. So what do we have to ask ourselves some questions. What fuel do we have now? And what could we use in the future? One of the biggest questions is the third question down there. Do we have single or three-phase electricity? And if we don't have three-phase electricity, could we get it? Why do we ask that? Well, three-phase electricity gives you probably enough capacity to heat a medium up to a large church. Single-phase electricity, probably rated at 80 or 100 amps, would just about squeak to a smaller church. It won't really give you adequate capacity for a medium or large church. So that's why that's an important question. A lot of low carbon heating, such as heat pumps of any size, need three-phase electricity. So is it available? In towns and larger conurbations, yes, three-phase electricity is probably available and affordable. In rural areas where there is not the infrastructure currently, it could be unaffordable or just not even practically available. If you go out and have a walk in a rural area and you see overhead lines with things that look like little radiators on poles, that's a little transformer, and that's a good indicator that the infrastructure isn't probably that good. And it could be extremely expensive because if you apply for a three-phase supply, the local network operator may have to go a long way back to be able to supply it. That should change in the future. So what I'm telling you now is what I'm telling you now, but you know, the UK has got to get to grips with its relatively poor infrastructure. How is the fuel delivered? So if it's oil or biomass, can we get it to where we need it to get? Obviously, oil is now being phased out. Are we replacing the heating system? So you've got to match the source to the system. So many problems are caused by mismatches. Putting, even in fossil fuel terms, putting a modern efficient boiler on a very old large capacity system does not always work very well. So that brings us on to what temperatures can a system work at. Most radiator systems are designed to work at around 80 degrees C. They often don't actually, for a whole load of reasons. They've become inefficient or they were just never really capable of it in the first place. But what can they work at? Because most things like heat pumps work at lower temperatures. What space do we have to put things in? Where could we put equipment? Can we put things inside, outside? Can we put things in a space that is appropriate and safe? And what can we afford or get funding for? A lot of questions there. So we come on to looking at heat sources. And the first grouping is our heat pumps. So I'm going to just have a look at the different types, because there's a few of them, and it's good just to get that into our minds, the different types. So the first type is a heat pump that goes to a wet system. What's a wet system? It uses hot water through radiators, fan convectors, underfloor heating, whatever. It heats water up. It works on electricity. As we've said, many churches will need a three-phase supply. You've got refrigerant gas in there, which is effectively the driving force. And very roughly, you get 2.5 to 4 times heat out for 1 kilowatt in. There are hybrid systems, or you can link boilers to them, where the size of heat pump would be too big, unaffordable, or not used at capacity for very much of the year. Where does heat pumps to wet systems, where does the heat come from? Well, it can come from the air. Somewhat miraculously, it's just a reverse fridge, really. It's less efficient than groundwater. The big issue that catches people out is that the efficiency varies an awful lot by season. So when the weather's mild outside, you might get 6 times heat out for one unit of electricity in. But when it's really, really cold, you might get 1 to 1.5. So the bills can be lumpy. Just be warned on that one. It will even out over the year, but it can be a bit of a shock in cold weather. The heat can come from water or ground, from boreholes, from buried coils, from rivers, lakes, geothermal sources. These are slightly less common, of course. They're much more efficient, or substantially more efficient than air. Steady seasonal output, but the capital cost is higher and there's more engineering and investigation needed. All of them are better linked to PV, because then you're getting free electrical input to them. Not necessarily to offset all of it, of course, but some of it. What does it look like? Well, the top, I'm hoping you can see things the same way. Anyway, the trenches, those are slinky coils. That's what's called a horizontal heat collector for a ground source heat pump. Cheapest, but you need a fair bit of land, as you can see. The little hole in the ground is a borehole, takes much less land, goes down a long, long way, typically 100 meters. Does need ground investigation, though, to make sure you've got suitable ground for it. The little middle picture is what the system looks like. It's not too bad. It's of course got no flues, so you can tuck away in a few corners. And the large picture shows you what an outdoor unit of an air to water heat pump looks like. It just looks like a commercial refrigeration unit, and that's what it is, really. But there's another type that I'm increasingly finding is useful, particularly in smaller churches, and these are air-to-air heat pumps. They're not the prettiest things in the world, I grant you, although you can put them in casing. They're quite efficient, but the nice thing about them is that some of them can run on single phase, and some of them you can do them in phases. So if you can only afford 3 to begin with, then you can put 3 in. And then when you get more funding, you can put more of them in. So you don't necessarily have to commit to a huge amount of funding. And you can also put them on top of an existing heating system, so that it can you can run the air-to-air heat pumps when they provide enough heat, and top up with your older fossil fuel system, and eventually phase it out. So it gives you a softer introduction to low carbon heating. But we can't disregard boilers, can we? I mean, they are the mainstay of our heating. Why choose a boiler system? Well, it gives you higher temperatures. It's compatible with the existing radiators. It can be low cost, but it can lock you into a high carbon source. Therefore, as a standalone solution, is unlikely to be accepted in this day and age if there is a viable alternative, and more often than not there is at least a partial viable alternative, if not 100% solution. So a quick summary of our boilers. We've got gas. We all know what a gas boiler is, so I'm not going to go through this word for word. The future is uncertain. Obviously, you will know that gas boilers are being phased out of new housing by 2025. Obviously, we will continue to be able to purchase gas boilers for a long time, but they're not a green solution at the moment. Biogas, really, there's poor availability on biogas. It may get better. There may be local availability that unusually, but in certain areas, particularly where there's farming and anaerobic digesters, you could have a local source of biogas. And that of course, would be a green solution if you could find it. So at the moment, biogas is a minority, but it is feeding already into the main grid. Hydrogen, lots of debate about hydrogen, uncertain, we don't know. There's likely to be hydrogen hubs in very high usage areas. Hydrogen is probably going to feed into the grid. Most boilers are suitable for conversion. So we don't know. At the moment, we don't know. But I don't think you can rely on it as a low carbon solution to say, well, I'll put a boiler in that's going to be converted to hydrogen. That really won't wash particularly if you're in a rural area, I think, because the chances of getting hydrogen are really quite low at the moment. Electric boilers are possible, but they can be incredibly expensive to run. And I would really not like to see them linked to an old slow response heating system, because you could end up with some horrible bills. But there's possibilities there. And liquid petroleum gas or cala gas available in rural areas, not a green solution, possibly going to be phased out, and is always going to be linked to the oil and gas industry. So generally not recommended. Oil we've already discussed, and biomass. So what is biomass? Well, it's a boiler that runs on wood wood pellet. We could also include, of course, in that log burners, but that's all biomass. The problem with biomass in inner city areas is air quality, because they do emit particulates and there's quite a lot of restrictions on them. Having said that, if you've got a rural area with a good availability of local biomass, then it is certainly a low carbon possibility. If you need an enthusiastic congregation that will manage the source. So I would always encourage people to be open-minded on biomass. And we need to look at where our boiler lives if we've got it, because unfortunately boilers live in some fairly damp, dark locations. And the one thing I would say is that a lot of modern electronics will not take kindly to the damp undercroft. And there's a few questions there about where we should put things, because I do come across a lot of unsafe and unwise locations for our plant. So not just boilers, but anything really. We need to think often about a new location. Obviously, electricity is a heat source, but I'm going to come on to that with the when we look at the actual emitters a little bit further in this presentation. A few considerations that we've already talked about. Have we got anything else? Well, there are some other sources. Churches used to have, quite often, very small churches had a wood burning stove, and a modern wood burning stove in a small church should be in our palette of possibilities. We obviously have to make sure that it's safe and that nobody gets burnt on them, but nonetheless, they are a nice, warm and traditional heat source. We have our photovoltaic panels, we have solar thermal that can, in some instances, heat our domestic hot water that comes out the taps, and our wood burning stoves. So now we come on to thinking about the system itself. This is the bit that delivers the heat to where you are. This is the bit that makes you comfortable. And of course, is probably the most important thing at the end of the day. It's what we see, it's what we feel, it's what we experience in our churches. First of all, we need to think about safety. A risk assessment, no matter how sort of simple, we need to think about our users. Have they got vulnerable adults, young children? Is our system safe for touch? If it is, then obviously we need to think about emitters that are either protected or are intrinsically low surface temperature. If we've got spaces where there's a lot of sport or activity is likely to be damaged. And a good example of copper pipe is not what it used to be. It's quite thin and was regularly been run into with vacuum cleaners until it was actually useless. So we have to think about what damage can occur. And can we keep people away from equipment? I mean, clearly we don't want anybody to be able to access boilers and controls. And have we got safety systems installed and working? But by that I mean, what happens if there's a fire? What happens if there's an emergency? What happens if there's the boiler or the heat source goes wrong? Have we got safety systems, and are they installed, working and checked? So things that might, for example, isolate our gas or oil. So coming on to then our choice of emitters, electric is a wide palette of availability. In summary, we've got radiant, we've got storage panels, under pew cushions, fan assisted. Let's have a look at a few of those, shall we? Electric radiant. You'll be familiar perhaps with the older fashioned radiant, but there's some really nice stuff around, you can see. Probably the chandeliers I'm showing you there are on the upper end of the budget, admittedly, but they look good and integrate well. There's a picture there of quite discreet high-level radiant heating. Catherine tells me that there's another chandelier manufacturer that's been trialled in Bristol, which doesn't have a glow and is actually somewhat cheaper than the stuff I've got illustrated there. So things are coming on the market all the time. The bottom right-hand picture, you can just see some white panels suspended, and they're called far heaters. They don't glow. They're not particularly hot, and they're very useful in certain instances. But you'll see there that they're mounted quite low, and they have to be, because if they're mounted too high, they really don't work. But where you can mount them quite low and near people, they're another useful form of radiant heating. So summing up on that one, we've got electric heating, radiant and far. People heating, delivering people where people are seated. So we've got cushions, carpets, platforms, under pew heating. You'll probably be familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend too long on it because I haven't got that much time. So we've got our cushions, and all of these, of course, are low carbon sources. Other electric sources, we've got night storage heaters, fan assisted, oil-filled radiators, and electric underfloor heating. All have got their uses. The only thing I'd say about electric underfloor is it can be very expensive to run, but it can be its uses for small, hard-to-treat areas. I've seen it used in a pilgrim sleeping space, which was only a few meters squared and was quite a good solution. So then we come to the family of heaters that are warm air. You'll see in the middle picture there a large gas-fired warm air heater that pumps warm air into the space. Not uncommon, not that common, but encountered a few times in churches. They, of course, are gas or oil, and therefore not a low carbon heating source. We've got our air-to-air heat pumps, which we've already talked about in heat pump section. So here they are again as a warm air heater, because that's what they do, they warm the air. And then we have sometimes encountered some historic warm air systems where a boiler did actually directly heat air in ducts. What's of use to us now? Probably only the air-to-air heat pumps, I guess. The direct or indirect gas or oil air handling systems are, if you've got one, you probably need to think about replacing it. We've got other systems, quite common. You might have come through gas-fired through the wall heaters, such as Drugasar and Volcana. They're quite expensive and they do go wrong after a period of time. What's really good about those is that as they go wrong, you can replace them with our air. So if you've got the electricity capacity, at least, the air-to-air heat pumps on a sort of modular basis. So they're probably going to gradually disappear, but you have got a good solution for them. Gas-fired radiant heating, very industrial. I've never seen it in a church. It is possible, and I have been asked questions about it. They're quite noisy, but again, as a gas, they may have their uses in sports halls, but not really in our Palatinate churches in general. And then you sometimes come across old plaque gas-fired radiant heating. So it looks like a radiant heater. It's got a gas supply to it. Unsafe generally, and really should, if you've got that, you need to be looking to replace it. It does put out quite unpleasant fumes into the space. And then lastly on our systems really is wet systems. This is the thing we are all familiar with. This is water as a heating medium. So we are with our radiators of one sort or another. Radiators are great. They're comfortable. They provide warmth, a perception of warmth particularly when they are close to where people are. They can take up quite a lot of wall space, but there are types that don't. If you've got cast iron radiators, don't dismiss them. They can produce a lot of heat for little space. They can be used on low temperatures as well, although they'll need to have additional capacity if you're putting a lower temperature to them. Fan convectors are where you've got a heating coil that's got hot water in it, and you a fan blows over that. They are so useful in many cases. You'll see a lot of cathedrals with them. They're very compact. You can put them in casings so they can be very discreet. They warm up rapidly. Yes, you do get some stratification under the roof, admittedly, with them. But generally, when the space, as long as you've got a fairly well draft-proof space, it slightly pressurizes and it produces good comfort. There are certain types you can use with heat pumps, but you can't assume that your old ones can be fitted to a heat pump because they will not necessarily be suitable. Some noise can be overcome with good selection. They do need maintaining. I see a lot of fan convectors, and I say, well, what's the last time they were cleaned? And everybody looks at me as if to say clean. Yes, they've got bits in them that muck up and get very dirty sometimes. They're generally cheaper for a new system than radiators are. And we can't leave wet systems without talking about underfloor heating. Many of you will know some excellent church examples of underfloor heating, but they're not necessarily right. What are the questions? Is the church used through the week? Because if it's only used occasionally, underfloor heating warms up very, very slowly and can lose its heat very, very fast. Do you need heating to the whole space? If you open doors, you can lose a lot of the heat. The other thing is it's difficult to get enough capacity into a church, an older church, because it needs a lot of heat input, and the underfloor heating can't deliver enough. And there's a lot of debate about destruction of historic floors, destruction of burials, archaeological remains. Changes in level is another big issue because you've got to insulate underneath and it causes changes in levels. And have we got a suitable heat source? But if you've got a well-insulated space and a heat pump, underfloor heating should definitely be considered for spaces that are used for a lot of the time. I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm not going to go over the summary of this because we've still got a few slides to go, but you will get the slides later. Controls. This comes into our heading of matching our supply to demand. We need good controls, but they need to be easy to use. There's some great stuff out there now. There's apps on your phone that can turn the heating on and off. So if you've got occasional meetings, you can really do that with the comfort of your home, which is a great news for church wardens. Does it respond to inside or outside temperatures? Sometimes that's an advantage, sometimes it is not. But again, this is where some expertise is needed. Does it turn on and off at the right time? Is it easily changed? And can we zone it in smaller heating? And is building a system protected against frost in the most carbon efficient way? Why is that important? So often you come across heating installations where the heating comes on at 3 o'clock in the morning because a detector that hasn't been positioned really very effectively has brought the system on thinking that it was going to freeze. Stage free frost protection is a very good idea. And if your bills are going wild for some reason, one of the things I would always look at is what frost protection systems you've got. Water doesn't freeze below 10. It doesn't need to be protected that much. And generally, buildings don't need to be protected against frost unless you've got something very precious in there. So to sum up, what do you do? Start with a long list of options. What could you do? Research, eliminate the impossible. Assess the suitability of the rest. What fits, what's right? And then look at not just the first cost, but the carbon and the running cost as well. Get yourself down to a short list, get some budget costs, seek advice, develop proposals, and of course, seek funding. Look at the whole life cost. What do I mean by whole life cost? What I mean is the capital cost plus the fuel and carbon, the fuel cost used of the life of the equipment, running cost now in the future. Where's cost going to go? Well, we can't possibly know, but then we couldn't predict what was going to happen to energy cost before. What we do know is it'll probably go up. It's not beyond the bound of possibility that we'll get carbon taxation in the future. What's the life of the equipment and what grants and subsidies can we get? You got more questions than answers? Well, get good impartial advice. Record what you have, what you need, set a budget for now, and remember one size does not fit all. Catherine, do you want to go straight on to questions, or should I just do the couple of case studies? Slightly running out of time here.
I think let's cover the case studies because people will find them very useful, I'm sure.
Okay, that's fine. A couple of minutes then. Done some case studies in the St Albans Diocese, very carefully chosen churches to represent a very typical cross-section of the type of church that is encountered in most dioceses. Here we have the line, we did 4, I did 2 on the other presentation. Here we have the very common large Victorian church that would, at one point in its history, probably have seated 800 to 1,000 people, but a congregation now of probably 40 or 50. It's got a gas boiler, it's not warm enough, and it's not fulfilling the mission and vision of the church. Obviously, funding is limited. So when I looked at that, when we did long option appraisal at that one, ideally the system would be replaced. But given the church's circumstances, a partial retention and phased approach is possible. Put some air-to-air heat pumps in for the time being, plus the gas retained in very cold weather. And if possible, put some PV on there. So this was a very classic hybrid, phased, manage things in chunks solution. And then this one was our very typical small to probably medium-sized, important rural church, important architecturally, as is common in rural situations. It doesn't have gas. It probably could get or already had 3-phase electricity. The heating system was at the end of its life and the oil-fired boiler was in the wrong place. Very good opportunity for ground source, although I'm not sure the church was found that probably perhaps a bit ambitious, but it was a very good opportunity for ground source because they had land not used for burials. But air source was a good option, and there was a discreet place to put it. But again, limited electrical supply, so might need to retain some fossil fuel for top up. So sometimes if you can't do everything, you can at least do something. And I take that last comment, hopefully, to take away, do something, not nothing. And questions?
Thank you so much, Susan. As I said on Tuesday, it's the practical wisdom that you bring to bear. Right, we've got a lot of questions. We've got 10 minutes. If you're happy to stop sharing your screen so
I will do that.
can see you bigger, that would be great. So those of you listening, I doubt we'll be able to get through all the questions. I'm going to take them in the order that they've got thumbs up. So if you haven't already, have a skim through the questions and click the thumbs up next to the ones that you're most interested in. So the first question is about the radiant heating. It's a question from John, who says, in the presentation, you went over radiant heating quite quickly. My understanding is that there are two types: near infrared, people heating, and far infrared, space heating. Would you confirm if this is correct and be able to explain the advantages and disadvantages of each?
I'm not familiar with that particular terminology. The far heating is actually the stuff that's near people, somewhat counterintuitively. I showed you the panels, the white panels that are quite near people. That is actually called far heating. Don't know quite what it stands for, actually, something radiant anyway. So the radiant heating that's got the glow to it is you can mount it at much higher places and it is still reasonably effective. The far you can't, it does need to be close to people to do that. The comfort effectively, some people find radiant heating gives them a hot head, cold feet syndrome. It hits the surface and warms it through the infrared. Far heating is more conventional. It operates a bit like a water radiator would over the top of you. Advantages and disadvantages, well, as I say, some people don't like the effect of radiant heating, but it is nonetheless, when you can't mount stuff near people, it's sometimes the only thing you can do. I think you pay your money, takes your choice. What I would say with these things is, if you're thinking about it, go and experience it somewhere. There's probably a church in your diocese that's got something or something similar, and see what you think.
The next question, I imagine this is a very common one. We've been told by a heating consultant that replacing our current gas-based system for infrared heaters would not be good for the fabric of our Victorian church building, e.g. driving out damp from the stonework. Is this a common problem for Victorian churches?
Right, okay. So if you've got a gas heating system and you have it on most of the time and you are keeping the system at 12 to 14 degrees C, you are keeping the salts within the fabric and you are keeping the fabric at a moderate temperature. For a Victorian church, doing that or not doing that is probably not terribly important. It tends to be more important for medieval churches where you've got stonework, and it's probably not a good idea to have heavy swings in temperature. So it does a church no harm to let the fabric go completely cold. What does it more harm is heating it up and cooling it down, heating it, because that moves the moisture in and out, and that can cause the stonework to flake. Infrared, you will not warm your fabric, and that does have comfort implications, because when a wall is warm, you feel warmer. When a wall is cold, you feel colder. But it won't do the fabric generally any harm. It depends on the fabric. If you've got wall paintings, if you've got precious ceiling paintings, precious woodwork, that's a conservation issue, and that is different. But in broad terms, some medieval churches do much better unheated than they do heated. Victorian churches more so, because generally a lot of them are brick. I don't know if this one's brick or not, but it doesn't do brick too much harm to let it go cold. Let's face it, it's on the outside of buildings, isn't it? So it's a difficult one.
Yeah, I would completely agree with everything you said there, Susan, that what my conservation colleagues tell me is that what delicate fabric really doesn't like is humidity going up and down, up and down, up and down. And that's generally driven by space heating being turned on and turned off and turned on and turned off and turned on and turned off. So for your fabric to be happy, exactly what Susan said, you either try and keep it level at this level by having space heating on all the time, but that's chewing through a lot of energy and carbon and money, or you actually say, we'll just keep the people warm and we'll let the fabric stay steady at a colder temperature.
Yeah.
If you've got an untreated damp problem, then you might need to be up here, but then you should ask yourself, can we deal with the damp problem? Can we solve the damp problem rather than managing the symptoms by running our heating a lot, because that's going to be costing you a lot of money and a lot of carbon. Right, so question from Richard. This isn't quite, it's sort of related to heating, but are destratification fans worth the cost? I generally hear fairly negative things about destratification fans. Are you the same?
Yeah, I am actually. Buoyancy is a dominant force. The best thing to do is to insulate the roof if you can, because if you've got fan convectors, if you've got a warm air system, for radiators it doesn't. They're really not much advantage at all. For a warm air system, you might, in an uninsulated roof, you're probably just going to be driving a bit of cold air down. They're very rarely effective enough to actually push heat right back down to where the occupied space is in high spaces. I haven't ever recommended one, and that's not to say I couldn't. There would be instances where if you've got well insulated factory with a warm air system, use de-strap fans. They're a common commercial. But the roof's insulated there, so it's just a different, and you've got much more powerful heaters. I just think, on the whole, not. But I am always open to being proved wrong.
Now, I think the answer to the next one is going to be an it depends. So Deleuze has asked, how high can radiant heaters be mounted to still be effective? In the photo, it looks as though they were quite high. I think that depends on the type of radiant heater and
Yes,
on the power of the heater, doesn't it?
So, bit of physics here. The heat decreases from radiant heater by a power of 4. So there's a rapid fall off of effectiveness. So basically, the higher you put them, the more you need. The far heaters are really ineffective. So it's the temperature by and a power of 4 on distance. The infrared are very hot, or they've got a radiant effect, whereas the far don't. So you need an expert on this one. Basically, the higher you put them, the more you need, is the top and bottom of it.
Oh, there are a lot of questions left, and it's 1 minute to 5. So I'm about to disappoint a lot of people. So I'm very sorry, we're not going to get to all of your questions. Susan, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate the thought and the care and the wisdom that you put into these webinars. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again at the end of June.
Yes, indeed.
Everyone who joined today, thank you so much for coming. Susan, if you don't mind sending me over your slides, then I can send them out to everybody. And I'll also
I think you probably already have them, but I will check.
Oh, I thought I had them from the first time, not from the first time.
I will
anyway,
check
that. We'll sort that out between us.
We'll sort that out between.
I'll send everyone the slides. I'll send you the links from the chat. I'll also include the links from Tuesday when we did topic 1, because there were some really useful links that were shared then as well. Thank you all for coming, and
Thank you.
Very good luck with all of your heating projects that I'm sure have brought you here today. Let me just save the chat so I don't lose the links and then bring us to a close. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thanks very much. Cheers.